from the blog, The Everyday Farmhouse. Today we're going to be making soap, and this one's a little bit different from anything I've ever made. We're going to be making a pine tar soap, and this is kind of a copycat or a knockoff recipe of the Dr.Squatch Pine Tar Soap that my 18-year-old son loves. So this is my attempt to copycat that recipe. So what's different about this recipe is, for one, it uses pine tar, which you should be able to source at your local Tractor Supply or Orscheln or one of those types of stores. Mine didn't have it for whatever reason. They had it online, and you can also find it on Amazon. The one thing you want to make sure is that the pine tar that you buy is creosote free. And so this one is, so it's safe to use in skincare. The other thing with the pine tar is that pine tar accelerates your soap. If you've never dealt with a fragrance oil or any other ingredient that accelerates, be warned. It's a challenging thing to deal with. And you have to take some specific steps in order to make sure it doesn't seize up while you're still mixing it. Meaning it turns to soap before you ever get it in the mold, before it's ever even fully mixed. So this is my third attempt at this soap. It finally came out perfectly. And I have all the details to share with you on how to make sure that this is a success. The other thing with this soap is that there are tons of additives in this. Not bad additives, just things like pumice to give it some grit. There's activated charcoal, which helps to give it that dark color, although the pine tar gives it a kind of a rich brown color itself. There's kaolin clay, which helps to keep the fragrance, kind of grounds the fragrance and makes it last longer. And I will say it really does work. This is one of the most fragrant bars I've ever made, and it has lasted. The fragrance almost is overwhelming at first, and then it calms down some. But there's pine essential oil in it and orange. I put a little eucalyptus as well. Even though the Squatch recipe didn't have that, I thought it would be a nice addition, and some cedarwood oil. So anyway, there's also ground up oats. So that gives it some more grit, and you want to grind those pretty fine. So I'm ready to share with you all the steps. One of the things that you have to make sure you do is keep the temperature of this low. Since the pine tar wants to bring it to trace so quickly, you need to have the temperature very low. So that means you cool your oils low. And if you use ice when you mix in your sodium hydroxide to make your lye solution, that keeps the temperature of your lye solution low as well. So that never was above 100 degrees. I kept everything right around 90, a little below 90. So that helps to give you a little bit more time to mix it up. The other thing you have to remember is not to use an immersion blender. I've had people ask, do you have to have an immersion blender to make soap? And usually it makes it much easier because there's quite a bit of mixing that goes in to getting that to come to trace. With this, you don't need an immersion blender. You just mix it by hand, and you want to work quickly because it's going to come to trace very fast, and you're going to want to get it into that mold. Another tip is to have all your ingredients measured out, including the additives. You'll dirty up a million dishes, but that's okay because then you know that everything's there. You're not going to be running to look for your salt or whatever else you're wanting to add. It's all right there so that you don't forget anything and you don't use up that precious time that you have before you get it in the mold. So if you're up for the challenge, let's get started. First, you'll need to gather all your ingredients. Go ahead and measure all of these out so that they're ready to go. These are also listed in the description. And all your additives as well. So get your workspace ready, get everything all measured out, and then we'll get started by mixing our oils. Because we're keeping the temperature low on this overall, because of the pine tar causing acceleration, I'm only going to melt and heat the hard butters, fats, so that I can just pour the liquid ones in, and that'll actually cool the temperature down a little bit when those are added. So it'll take a little less time for it to cool down if I don't heat everything. So just keeping in mind through this whole process, you're trying to keep the temperature low or let it cool to a good low temperature. Of course, you can't cool it, to lower than room temperature or anything because your fats would harden again. So, it'll have to be somewhere around 85 or 90 degrees to keep those liquid so that you can work with them. Okay, after your solid butters and fats are melted, go ahead and add the pine tar while that's warm. And just know that the pine tar is going to be difficult to wash off. It does, water and soap do dissolve it, but it's kind of got a slick, I don't know, a little bit of a greasy feeling to it. So you might wipe it out with a paper towel or something first and then use soap and water so it's not all over your kitchen sponge and everything like that. But it mixes in best when the other oils are warm, so you just stir that in, and eventually you might want to switch to a whisk to really get your ingredients combined. Next, you'll want to add the rest of the oils, the room temperature oils that didn't need to be melted down. Go ahead and mix those in and just get all of that together thoroughly. Now, it's a good idea to check your temperature and just make sure that you're staying, just know where you are, because you're going to want to keep this around 85 to 90 degrees so that it doesn't come to trace too quickly. Some of the other additives like the kale and clay can also accelerate trace a little bit, but since we're working at such a low temperature, it turns out fine. You just want to make sure that you don't wait too long to add all of that in. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of my additives in, and this is when I'll need to grab a whisk to really get everything incorporated well. That's the ground up oats. I'll add in the activated charcoal, the clay with the fragrance oils, and the pumice as well at this point, and just kind of whisk it and try to get it mixed together as best you can. Actually, when I put the kale and clay in, it was mixed with about a teaspoon of water and just a little bit of the fragrance oil. I actually put the fragrance oil in later in the process. What you do next is the key to the success of this soap, and that is to use ice. I measured out the water on my scale and then poured it into an ice cube tray and froze it. It's not completely frozen solid. This was, I think, an hour or so, a couple hours, I can't remember, but long enough that it's cold. And so then I'm going to take the sea salt and pour that over the ice. And then after that, I'll add the sodium hydroxide, which you'll see will begin to melt the ice, and just stir that together. You're wanting to keep this at a low temperature. You don't want it to rise really high and then have to wait for it to cool. Just if you do it this way, then you can go ahead and mix your lye solution and your oils together without setting it aside and waiting for hours. And now, once everything's mixed together well, I'll give it another whisk. And after I've checked the temperature to make sure they're both about the same temperature, at or around 90 degrees or a little lower is good, I'm going to take my lye solution and I'm going to pour that into the melted oils and all the other combined ingredients. I still have most of my fragrance oil set aside. There's about 2 ounces of some mixed oils. Pine essential oil being the main ingredient there for the fragrance. I will add that in, and you do not need an immersion blender. That's the other major thing that you don't want to do. You don't want to accelerate this at all. You'll see that this already starts to come to trace just by combining it. That pine tar really accelerates the process. And a lot of times fragrance oils can accelerate as well. So I'm going to add those in pretty quickly, as I'm going to want to move pretty fast with this. If you used a whisk or an immersion blender, it would come to trace even faster, and you can see just by stirring it gently, it's already coming to trace. So I'm going to pour in those fragrance oils and then quickly get it into the mold. This was just kind of a makeshift mold that I made with a Tupperware container that I had, and I lined it with parchment paper. It worked out okay. It wasn't exactly ideal, but my other mold was being used. So if you're in a pinch, you can, if you're not selling your soap and if it's just for your own use, it doesn't really matter. You can cut it to whatever size you want. And I ended up cutting these to pretty thick bars, but it turned out just fine. Okay, so I just wrapped this in a towel and left it out on the counter overnight, and it hardened up really nicely. And I don't know why I don't have footage of me cutting the bars, but came out nicely, and I ended up cutting it into bars, and it just turned out to be a beautiful soap that is just so nice to use. Okay, so that's it. If you followed along, hopefully you got your soap into the mold, and it should be ready by tomorrow. 24 hours in the mold. You should be able to take it out of the mold and cut it. And of course mine are extremely thick, but I think my husband and my son will like that just fine. I didn't have a second mold, and I had another batch of soap going, so I just used a Tupperware container that I had, which is fine. You can use a cardboard box lined with parchment paper or whatever for a mold if you don't want to spend the extra money on a second mold. So hopefully it turned out for you. Let it cure for 4 to 6 weeks so that it's nice and hard and it lasts a really long time in the shower or the bath. And I hope you love this soap. It smells so good, and it's really nice, and it's fun to make a soap that my husband actually wants to use. It doesn't smell like lavender or rose or anything else. It smells very woodsy and manly, and it's a great cleansing bar. So I hope you give it a try. Be sure to ask any questions you have in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. Have a great day.